Welcome, beautiful soul. Before a single word reaches your heart today, know this: you are already wrapped in the warmest, most luminous light the heavens have to offer. The angels are here. They have gathered around you at this very moment, not by accident, not by coincidence, but because you were called here. You were guided here. There is a blessing being poured over you right now, as real and as present as the breath moving through your body. Can you feel it? That quiet warmth? That gentle settling in your chest? That is not your imagination. That is heaven saying, "We see you, we love you, and we have something extraordinary to tell you." Welcome, dear one, to Angel's message for you. Now, before we go any further, we need you to stay with us. What is about to be shared with you is not something to rush through. It is not a message you want to skip ahead on, because buried inside what is coming next is a truth so personal, so specific, so deeply woven into the story of your life, that the moment you hear it, something inside you is going to shift. A door is going to open, and you are going to understand, maybe for the first time in a long time, that everything you have been through, every hard night, every moment of doubt, every prayer that felt unanswered, was actually moving you straight toward this, toward right now. So please stay with us. Every single word matters, because this message was meant for you. You are someone who has felt it. Deep in the quiet places of your spirit, you have carried a knowing, a soft, persistent whisper, that something beautiful was on its way to you. Not something ordinary, something real, something that would finally make sense of all the waiting. You have had moments where you almost let yourself fully believe it, and then life would get loud again, and that whisper would get buried under the noise. But here is what heaven wants you to know today. That whisper was never wrong. It was never wishful thinking. It was a message from the angels, planted in your soul long before this moment, telling you to hold on. Because what is coming is worth every single day you held on. Your soulmate is on the way to you, not someday, not eventually. Now, the path between the two of you has been cleared. The things that once stood between you, the timing, the circumstances, the lessons that needed to be learned, they have all been resolved. Heaven has been working behind the scenes with a precision that would take your breath away if you could see it all. And the angels are here right now to pull back the curtain and show you what has been happening in the invisible world, so that you can step into your present with eyes wide open and a heart fully prepared to receive what is already on its way. Breathe for just a moment. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Because this is not a message about waiting longer. This is a message about arrival. This is heaven saying, the waiting is almost over. Let us begin at the very foundation of this truth, because understanding it will change everything. Every single experience you have had in your life, every relationship that didn't work out, every plan that fell apart, every night you cried wondering if love was even real, none of it was punishment. None of it was proof that you were unworthy or unlucky or forgotten. Every single one of those experiences was a classroom, and you graduated, maybe not with a diploma or a ceremony, but with something far more valuable. You graduated with clarity. You know now, in a way you simply could not have known before, exactly what kind of love you are looking for. You know how you want to be treated. You know the difference between love that drains and love that fills. You know the difference between connection that is real and connection that is performance. That knowledge is not small. That knowledge is the exact thing that will allow you to recognize your soulmate the moment they arrive. And more importantly, it is the thing that will allow you to actually keep that love, to nurture it, to let it grow into something that lasts. The angels want you to understand something that most people never fully grasp. The preparation period, the time you spent in the waiting, was not empty time. It was the most important time, because a love that arrives before you are ready for it cannot stay. It has nowhere to take root. But a love that finds you when your heart has been shaped by real experience, real reflection, and real self-understanding. That love has everything it needs to become the kind of story that gets more beautiful with every chapter. You are ready now. The angels see it clearly. The version of you that is here today is not the same version who once settled, who once doubted, who once accepted less than what your soul was calling for. You have been changed, refined, strengthened, and that strength is exactly what is needed for the love that is coming. Now let us talk about what has been happening on the other side of this equation, because your soulmate has been on their own journey. This person has also been through experiences that shaped them, lessons that humbled them, moments that brought them to their knees and forced them to decide who they truly wanted to be. The angels have been working in their life just as faithfully as they have been working in yours. There were decisions that had to be made. There were chapters that had to close. There were things this person had to let go of in order to show up for you the way you deserve. And all of that has been happening. All of those internal shifts, those private transformations, they have been taking place quietly, steadily, because heaven does not rush the sacred. It refines it. What this means for you is profound. When this person arrives in your physical world, they will not arrive as someone who needs to be fixed or changed. They will arrive as someone who has done the work. They will arrive ready, not perfect, no one ever is, but genuine, intentional, clear about what they want. And what they want is you, not a version of you, not a performance of you, the real, full, complicated, beautiful you. Think about what that means. The person who is moving toward you right now has chosen, on a soul level, to be with someone like you. They are not coming to fill a gap or escape loneliness. They are coming because there is a pull, a calling, that keeps drawing them in your direction. That pull is the angel's handiwork. That pull is destiny honoring itself. There is something important we want you to sit with. The road between you and your soulmate has no more detours. There is no more obstacle that has the power to keep you apart. Whatever once blocked the path, whether it was circumstances, timing, geography, or internal readiness, it has all been removed. The angels have ensured it. This is not a metaphor or a beautiful idea. This is a spiritual reality that is already manifesting in the physical world. Step by step, detail by detail. Things are aligning around you right now that you may not even be able to see yet, but they are moving. Trust that. You may have noticed some signs recently. Maybe they have felt subtle. A song that played at just the right moment and stirred something in your chest. A thought about love that came out of nowhere, soft and hopeful. A dream that left you with a warm feeling you could not quite explain when you woke. Unexpected conversations with strangers that felt oddly meaningful. Small encounters that seemed like coincidences but left a trace on your spirit. The angels want you to know, none of that was random. Every single one of those moments was a sign, a gentle reminder, planted in your everyday life, to tell you that love was getting closer. Heaven was warming your heart, preparing you to be able to recognize the moment when it arrived, softening the soil so the seed could take root. Your soulmate has been receiving signs too. There have been moments in their life recently, nudges, feelings, unexplained pulls toward certain places, certain conversations, certain choices, that were quietly shortening the distance between you. They may not have understood it all as it was happening, but they followed it. Something inside them kept saying, "Go this way," and they listened. And every time they listened, they got one step closer to you. This is the beauty of how heaven works. It does not announce itself with thunder. It whispers. It nudges. It places the exact right person in the exact right place at the exact right moment. And then it steps back and watches the miracle unfold naturally, as if it were simply meant to be. Because it is. There are going to be people who will ask you, when this beautiful thing unfolds in your life, how it happened. And you will find it difficult to fully explain. Because the truth is, it happened on so many levels at once. It happened in the physical world, yes. But it also happened in the spiritual world, long before any visible meeting ever took place. Heaven saw you two together and decided it was time. And once heaven decides something, it happens. There is no force on earth strong enough to stop what love has been given divine clearance to become. Now, we want to speak very directly about what this arrival is going to feel like. Because the angels do not want you to miss it when it comes. They do not want you to be so caught up in your head, so focused on what you imagined it would look like, that you overlook what it actually is. When your soulmate enters your world, there is going to be something undeniable in the air. It will not necessarily look like a movie scene. It might be completely ordinary on the outside. A conversation, a crossing of paths, a simple and unremarkable moment by every external measure. But internally, something will be unmistakable. Your body is going to know before your mind does. There will be a stillness that comes over you, even if you feel a flutter of nervousness, a sense of recognition, like meeting someone you somehow already know. Even though your logical mind cannot explain why, your heart will be calm and racing at the same time, which sounds like a contradiction. But if you have ever experienced it before, even briefly, you understand. It is the feeling of finding something you did not realize you had been searching for. Do not dismiss this feeling. Do not talk yourself out of it. Do not let past disappointments make you cynical toward this moment. The angels are asking you to be brave enough to let yourself feel it without immediately building walls. Because the walls you have built, and you have every right to have built them, given what you have been through, those walls were protection during the waiting. But the waiting is ending. And walls that once protected you from harm could now accidentally protect you from joy. It is time to let them soften. Not to disappear entirely, not to be reckless, but to become doors instead of barriers. The eyes will say a lot. Pay attention to the eyes. There is truth that lives in the way someone looks at you, real truth that cannot be manufactured or performed. Your soulmate will look at you in a way that communicates something beyond words. There will be presence in that look, interest, care, and something that feels ancient, like this gaze has found you before in some way neither of you can articulate. Trust what you feel in that moment. Your soul knows how to read it. The voice will carry something too. The tone, the cadence, the way they choose their words. There will be a sincerity in how this person speaks to you that stands apart from the noise of everyday conversation. You will feel heard, even in the earliest moments. You will feel like the things you say matter to them. This is not charm or performance. This is what it feels like to be in the presence of someone who genuinely wants to know you. And then there will be the consistency. Pay attention to this especially, because actions over time are where true love reveals itself most clearly. Your soulmate will be consistent. The care they show in the beginning will not evaporate when the initial excitement fades. They will show up. They will follow through. When they say something, they will mean it. When they make a commitment, they will honor it. This is what the angels have been preparing in this person. This is the fruit of the work they have been doing on themselves. And it will be evident. Not perfectly, because again, no one is without flaws, but genuinely, authentically. And that authenticity will be something you have never quite experienced in this way before. This love is going to bring things into your life that you did not even know to ask for. It will bring a kind of peace that settles into your daily existence and does not leave. It will bring laughter that feels effortless. It will bring the kind of companionship that makes ordinary Tuesday evenings feel like something worth celebrating. It will bring honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable, because real love does not hide from the truth. It faces it together. It will bring a sense of partnership that runs through every area of your life, not just the romantic moments, but the practical ones, the hard ones, the mundane ones. You will know what it feels like to truly not walk alone. And perhaps most beautifully, this love will make you more of who you already are. Not less, not smaller, more. Your soulmate is not coming to complete you because you are already whole. They are coming to walk alongside the wholeness you already carry, and in doing so, to help you expand it, to inspire you toward the version of yourself that is still becoming, to be a mirror that reflects your best qualities back to you on the days when you cannot see them yourself. This is what sacred partnership looks like. This is what the angels have been protecting for you. Now we want to speak about something that is important, and we speak about it with love. The state of your inner world matters deeply as you move into this season of arrival. Not because you need to be perfect. You do not. But because the quality of what you carry inside yourself will shape the quality of how you receive and experience this love when it arrives. Heaven has done its part. Now there is a beautiful and joyful responsibility that falls to you. The responsibility of being ready in your own heart and life. What does that look like practically? It looks like caring for yourself with the same level of devotion you would give to someone you deeply love. Because you are someone worth loving deeply. Eat the food that nourishes you. Protect your sleep. Move your body in ways that feel good. Take the walks. Drink the water. Do the small, ordinary things that honor the body you live in. This is not vanity. This is stewardship. And when you take care of yourself this way, you show up to every interaction, including the one that is coming, with an energy that is clear, present, and open. On the emotional level, there is work to do that only you can do, and the angels are with you in every moment of it. Release what is old, not in a forced or rushed way, but in the way that comes from genuinely choosing your future over your past. If there are resentments from previous relationships sitting in your chest, feelings of being let down, being hurt, being made to feel like you were too much or not enough, those feelings deserve to be acknowledged. Sit with them. Let yourself feel them fully without judgment. And then, one by one, make the choice to release them. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to the people who hurt you. It is a gift you give yourself. It is the act of taking back the energy that pain has been borrowing and redirecting it toward the life you are building. This does not mean erasing the past or pretending it did not happen. It means choosing not to let it write the story of your future. Because your future, the one that is already unfolding, is a brand new story. It deserves to be received with fresh eyes and an open heart. On the mental level, notice the thoughts you think about love. Notice the stories you tell yourself about whether you are worthy of what is coming, whether it is really real, whether something will go wrong. Our minds, especially after we have been hurt, develop a kind of automatic skepticism. A defense mechanism that says, "Don't get your hopes up." The angels understand why that mechanism developed. It was protection. But now it is time to gently, lovingly question those automatic thoughts. When the voice in your head says, "This is too good to be true," answer it. Talk back to it. Remind it of what you know. That heaven has been working on this, that the signs have been real, that you are worthy of a love that stays. prepare your daily life too. This might mean something as practical as looking at your schedule and asking yourself where you have been making space for connection. When you are so busy, so locked into routine, that there is no room for anything new to enter, love struggles to find the opening. Not because it is not trying, but because life has to have some breathing room in it for the extraordinary to slip in. Do not overschedule yourself in this season. Make time to be present. Make time to show up to the places and situations that feel alive to you. Say yes to the invitation you would usually turn down. Take the walk in the park instead of staying home. Go to the gathering you have been putting off. Heaven often arranges its most sacred meetings in the most ordinary of places, but only if we are actually there. Spiritually, keep the connection alive. However that looks for you. Prayer, meditation, quiet time, gratitude journaling, walking in nature, sitting still and breathing and simply being thankful for what is. Do it. Do it consistently. This spiritual practice is not separate from your love life. It is foundational to it. When you are grounded in something larger than yourself, when you carry a sense of peace that does not depend on external circumstances, you become a magnet for the kind of love that wants to grow in stable soil. Your peace is attractive. Your groundedness is magnetic. Your connection to the sacred creates a frequency that your soulmate can feel, even before they can explain why they are drawn to you. Work on your ability to communicate honestly. This one is so important. The relationship that is coming is going to be the kind where real communication is not just encouraged. It is the lifeblood. Your soulmate is coming with a genuine desire to understand you and to be understood by you. But that kind of connection requires vulnerability. It requires the courage to say what you actually feel, to share what you actually need, to express what you actually hope for, without editing yourself into something more palatable. Start practicing that now. In your relationships with friends, with family, with yourself. Practice saying the true thing. Practice letting yourself be known. Because the love that is coming is looking for the real you, not the curated version, the real one. There is one more thing the angels want to say about preparation, and it may be the most important thing of all. Do not wait until your soulmate arrives to start living fully. Do not put your joy on pause. Do not tell yourself that things will really begin when love arrives. Because love arrives to meet someone who is already living their life with joy and purpose, not someone who has been holding their breath, waiting. So pursue the things that make you feel alive. Create, learn, explore, laugh with the people you love. Take up the hobby you have been putting off. Plan the trip. Start the project. Be fully and completely in your life right now, in this season, even before the arrival. And watch how that aliveness, that fullness acts as a beacon. Heaven loves to bring love to people who are already in love with their lives. We want to take a moment now to speak about the moment itself. The actual, physical, real-world moment when your soulmate enters your life. The angels want you to be present for it in a way that you have rarely been present for anything before. When it happens, your mind might race. You might feel an urge to analyze or evaluate or second-guess. That is okay. It is natural. But underneath that mental activity, there is going to be something that does not waver. Something that simply knows. That knowing, that quiet, unshakable recognition, is the voice of your soul. Honor it. Do not let the noise of your mind talk you out of what your soul already sees clearly. Be yourself in that moment, not a performance of yourself, not the version of yourself that you think is most impressive or most likable. Just you, exactly as you are, with all your warmth and your humor and your history and your heart. Because the extraordinary thing about meeting your true person is that being yourself is the most magnetic thing you can do. Your authenticity is what they have been drawn to. Your realness is what they have been looking for. Let them see it. Show interest. Ask questions. Listen. Really listen. Not just waiting for your turn to speak, but genuinely taking in what they are sharing with you. There is a kind of listening that makes people feel profoundly seen and safe, and it is one of the most beautiful gifts you can offer in any moment of connection. Give that gift. It will set the tone for everything that follows. And when care is shown to you, whether through a small act of consideration or a thoughtful gesture or simply the way they pay attention to you, let yourself receive it. Do not deflect. Do not minimize. Do not say, "Oh, that's not necessary." Receive it gracefully. Say thank you and mean it. This act of receiving with openness tells the universe and tells your soulmate that you are ready, that there is space in your life for this, that you will honor what they offer. The angels want to talk about what happens after the meeting, too, because this relationship, the one that is coming, is not a fairy tale that ends the moment the two of you find each other. It is a story that is just beginning, and like all real, meaningful stories, it will have its chapters of ease and its chapters of challenge. There will be days of joy so full you will want to bottle it. And there will be days that ask both of you to dig deeper, to be more patient, to communicate with more care, to choose love even when it is not the easy choice. The angels are not promising you a life without difficulty. They are promising you a partner who will face difficulty beside you. There is a profound difference. Real love is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of respect when conflict arises. It is the commitment to work through hard things rather than walking away. It is the daily choice to show up for each other even when showing up takes effort. Your soulmate is coming with that kind of love, the durable kind, the kind that does not evaporate when life gets complicated. And the growth you have done in yourself has prepared you to offer the same in return. Think about what it will feel like to have a real partner in your daily life. Not just in the romantic sense, but in the truest sense. Someone who is in your corner. Someone you can call when something goes wrong, knowing they will show up without having to be convinced. Someone whose presence in the small moments, making coffee in the morning, sitting quietly at the end of a long day, sharing a laugh about something silly, fills an ordinary life with extraordinary warmth. Someone who brings out your capacity for joy, for patience, for growth, just by being who they are. Someone who makes home feel like a feeling more than a place. That is what is coming. Not perfection, not a fantasy, but something better than either of those things. Something real. The angels want you to sit for a moment in gratitude. Not gratitude for something you are still waiting for, though that is powerful too, but gratitude for the path that brought you here. For every experience that shaped you. For every challenge that strengthened you. For every moment of loneliness that deepened your capacity for connection. For every prayer that felt unanswered but was actually being answered in a way you could not yet see. For the version of yourself that persisted through all of it and is still here, still open, still willing to believe. That version of you is extraordinary. That version of you is who your soulmate is coming to find. Gratitude is one of the most powerful frequencies you can carry. It signals to the universe that you are aware of the good that is already present, and that you are ready to receive more. When you move through your days from a place of genuine thankfulness, for your health, for your mind, for your creativity, for the people who love you, for the beauty that shows up in ordinary moments, you become someone who is magnetically aligned with what heaven is sending your way. So practice gratitude. Make it a daily habit. Let it become the lens through which you see your life. And speak kindly to yourself. This is so important. The way you talk to yourself in the quiet of your own mind is either building you up for what is coming or slowly chipping away at your readiness for it. When that inner voice gets critical, when it starts listing all the reasons why you are not quite enough, answer it with truth. You are enough. You have always been enough. Your worth has never been determined by your relationship status or your history or your struggles. It is inherent. It is given. It is not something you have to earn. And the love that is coming, the real heaven-sent love, will confirm this truth in ways that settle it deep into your bones. But you do not have to wait for that confirmation to start believing it now. Tell yourself what is true. I deserve love. I am ready for love. Love is already on its way to me, and I am open to receive it. Say it until you feel it. Say it until your nervous system relaxes into it. Because the most important preparation you can do is in the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. Let us speak now about time, because we know that one of the hardest things about this season of anticipation is the not knowing. The not knowing exactly when. The not knowing exactly how. The mind wants a timeline. It wants specifics. And the angels understand that. But here is what they want you to understand about divine timing. It is not slow because something is wrong. It is precise because something is being perfected. Every moment that has passed has been doing something essential. Every day of the waiting has been building something that the arrival requires. And now that everything is in place, the timing is no longer waiting on anything. The path is clear. The alignment is complete. What once felt like delay is now resolved. This does not mean it will happen tomorrow or next week. The angels cannot hand you a calendar date. And if they could, it would rob the meeting of its magic. But what they can tell you with complete certainty is that the movement is already underway. Things are already shifting in the visible world to create the circumstances that will bring you together. The gears are turning. The setup is happening. And it is happening faster than you might think, because when heaven clears a path, things move. So in the meantime, in this beautiful, holy, in-between time, live. Love your life. Love the people in it. Love yourself. Stay awake to the signs. Stay open to the unexpected. Be willing to be surprised by how it unfolds, because heaven's plans are almost always more creative and more perfect than anything we could have designed on our own. Do not withdraw from life while you wait. Do not become so focused on the destination that you miss the journey. The journey itself is sacred. These days, these exact days you are living in right now before the arrival, are part of your story too. They are worth living fully. They are worth showing up for with your whole heart. And know this, you are never alone in the waiting. The angels are with you every single day. They are walking beside you through every ordinary moment. They are cheering for you. They are working on your behalf in ways both seen and unseen. When you feel lonely, call on them. When you feel afraid, ask them to come close. When you feel hopeless, let them remind you of what they are telling you right now. You are loved by heaven. You are seen by heaven. And heaven is conspiring in your favor. The moment is coming when everything you have felt in your spirit will stand before you in the physical world. Your soulmate, the one who has been shaped and guided and prepared for you, is drawing closer with every day that passes. The connection you have always sensed was possible, the kind of love that actually lasts, the partnership that lifts rather than diminishes. It is not a fantasy. It is a destiny, and it is yours. When that day arrives, you will remember this. You will remember these words, this feeling, this moment of knowing. and you will look back and see with perfect clarity how every single piece of your journey was leading you here. Every detour was direction in disguise. Every loss was space being made. Every hard night was strengthening what would need to be strong. And you will feel at the deepest level that you were never abandoned. Not for a single moment. Heaven was always working. Love was always coming. Receive this message not just with your mind, but with your whole being. Let it settle into you. Let it become part of the foundation you stand on. And then step forward into your day, into your life, as someone who knows what the angels know. That love is real, that love is coming, and that love is worthy of every day you chose to believe in it. We also want to speak about something that does not get talked about enough in conversations about love, and that is the role of joy. Not the kind of joy that depends on external conditions. Not the kind that only shows up when everything is going perfectly, but the kind of deep, rooted, unconditional joy that lives in you as your birthright. The kind that says, I choose to find beauty in this moment, even while I am still becoming, even while the best is still on its way. This kind of joy is not naive. It is not pretending that everything is fine when it is not. It is the radical act of deciding that your happiness is not a hostage to the future, that you will not put your aliveness on hold until the right person arrives, until the circumstances change, until life looks the way you have been picturing it. Joy now, in the middle of the journey before the destination is reached, is one of the most powerful spiritual acts there is. And the angels are encouraging you to practice it deliberately. What brings you joy today? Not someday. Today. Is it the way the light comes through your window in the morning? The taste of your favorite food? A playlist that makes you feel something? A conversation with someone who makes you laugh until your sides hurt? A walk somewhere that reminds you how big and beautiful this world is? Whatever it is, pursue it. Make time for it. Refuse to let the waiting steal your ability to enjoy what is already good about your life. Because here is a truth the angels want to plant deep in your heart. Love is drawn to joy. Not in a superficial way. Not because you have to be performing happiness all the time, but because genuine joy, the kind that radiates from someone who is genuinely alive and present and grateful, creates an energy field that is irresistible. Your soulmate is not looking for someone who has everything figured out or who never struggles. They are looking for someone who is real, who is warm, who is alive, who laughs genuinely, who cares deeply, who shows up with their heart present. Be that person now, not just in anticipation of love, but because you deserve to be that person for yourself in this moment, regardless of what is still coming. Let us talk for a moment about the days ahead, the actual unfolding of this chapter that heaven has already begun writing. There is going to come a point, and it may be sooner than you expect, when you look around at your life and realize that things have quietly shifted, that new people have entered your orbit, that conversations are flowing more easily, that you are feeling drawn to places and situations that feel fresh and alive. Pay attention to all of it. Do not dismiss any of it as coincidence, because when heaven is orchestrating an arrival, it starts by rearranging the landscape of your daily life to create the openings that need to exist. You might get an unexpected invitation and feel a pull to say yes. Follow that pull. You might find yourself in a conversation with someone who, by the end of it, has connected you to a situation or a person or an opportunity that matters. Follow that thread. You might feel a quiet but persistent nudge to try something new. A new place, a new routine, a new way of spending your time. Listen to that nudge. The angels communicate through these gentle, persistent feelings. And the ones who follow them consistently find that their lives unfold with a kind of guided grace that defies ordinary explanation. Your soulmate is being guided too. There are things happening in their life right now. Shifts in direction, openings in schedule, decisions being made, that are all part of the same divine choreography. The two of you are being moved toward the same space, the same moment, the same meeting. Heaven is taking care of the logistics. Your only job is to be present, be open, and be ready to say yes when the moment arrives. And when it does arrive, when you are standing in that moment that you have heard about today, the one where everything clicks, remember to be fully there. Put your phone away. Stop narrating it in your head. Stop trying to analyze whether it is happening the way you imagined it would. Just be in it. Let it be the most present you have ever been. Because moments like this are rare and they deserve to be lived, not observed. There will be a time, not long from now, when you will think back to this day, the day you heard these words, the day the angels spoke this truth over your life, and you will smile. You will smile because you will be living the evidence. You will be in the middle of the love story that was described to you before it began. And the feeling in that moment will be one of the deepest forms of gratitude a human heart can hold. Gratitude for every step. Gratitude for every sign. Gratitude for every day of the waiting that made the arrival so profoundly meaningful. The angels want you to carry this with you. You are not someone who love passes by. You are not someone who has to fight for the crumbs of love while watching others have the whole feast. You are someone who is deeply, specifically, intentionally loved by heaven and by the person who is on their way to you. Your story is not over. It is not even at the hardest part anymore. You have come through that. What is ahead is the chapter you are going to read over and over again, the one that makes you grateful for every single thing that came before. Hold your head up, open your heart, keep your spirit alive with prayer and gratitude and joy. Keep being the beautiful, real, whole person that you already are. And trust with every fiber of your being that what heaven has promised is not just possible. It is inevitable. It is already on its way. And it is going to be everything you always knew love could be. You are protected. You are loved. You are guided. And you are walking, right now in this very moment, toward the most beautiful chapter of your story. May heaven's blessing rest on you today and every day that follows. May you walk in peace. May you live in joy. May love find you exactly when it is meant to, exactly as it is meant to, exactly as you deserve. With infinite love always. Amen.